The bell on the harbor tower rang 3 times before dawn, and nobody in Ravenmore understood why. Edmund Hale heard it first. He was already awake, sitting by the tall window of his study with a cane resting against his knee, watching the black water beyond the cliffs. His leg had not let him sleep properly in 3 years, not since the fall that shattered his hip and left him walking with a slow, uneven step that the court found so easy to laugh at. But that night, it was not the pain that kept him awake. It was the water. The tide had gone out too far. Edmund had watched tides his whole life, first as a boy running along the docks before his accident, and later as a man forced to study them from a window because his legs would not carry him fast enough to chase the waves anymore. He knew the rhythm of Ravenmore's coast the way a musician knows a song they have played 1,000 times. And that night, the song was wrong. He pulled himself up using the edge of his desk, gripped his cane, and made his way to the door. Every step sent a jolt of pain up through his hip, but he had long since learned to walk through it without slowing down. Outside, the corridor was cold and empty. Guards were supposed to patrol at this hour, but most had grown used to ignoring the Duke's late-night wanderings. They assumed he could not go far. They were wrong more often than they realized. By the time Edmund reached the harbor tower, the sky had turned a strange shade of gray. Not the soft gray of early morning, but something heavier, almost yellow at the edges. Fishermen were already gathering near the docks, murmuring to each other, pointing at the horizon. The water had pulled back so far that the sand usually hidden beneath the waves lay exposed and glistening under torchlight, littered with shells and stranded fish gasping in shallow puddles. An old fisherman named Corwin stood near the rope railing, staring at the exposed seabed with a face pale as ash. Edmund had known Corwin since childhood, back when Edmund could still run down these same docks without a cane. "Corwin," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the pain in his leg. "How far out has it gone?" Corwin turned, startled to see the Duke standing there in the cold, wrapped only in a traveling coat thrown hastily over his night-clothes. "My lord, I have never seen it pull back this far, not in 40 years of fishing these waters." Edmund's stomach tightened. He had read about this before, buried in his father's old journals, dismissed for decades as superstition scribbled by a paranoid man in his final years. His father had written about a night just like this one, describing the sea pulling away from the shore before something terrible arrived. Edmund had read the passage 100 times without understanding it. Now, standing on the docks with cold wind biting his face, he understood completely. "Get everyone off the lower docks," Edmund said. "Now, move the boats up, move the people back from the water." Corwin hesitated. Around him, other fishermen exchanged uncertain glances. They respected Edmund, more than the nobles in the castle ever did, but even they had heard the whispers about his mind since the accident, about grief and pain twisting his thoughts. "My lord, the tide does this sometimes before a storm," one younger fisherman offered carefully. "It will come back." "Not like this," Edmund said. "Please, I am asking you to trust me for 1 hour. If I am wrong, I will stand here and let you laugh at me until sunrise. But if I am right, we do not have much time." Something in his voice must have carried weight, because Corwin finally nodded and began shouting orders down the dock, waving lanterns, calling families out of the small fishing huts built too close to the water line. Edmund watched them move, his hands tightening around his cane, praying silently that he was wrong, that this was nothing more than an unusual tide, and his father's old warnings were simply the ramblings of a frightened man. But deep in his chest, a cold certainty had already settled. He was not wrong. He made his way back up the stone steps toward the castle, each movement slower than the last, sweat gathering on his forehead despite the chill in the air. By the time he reached the great hall, the morning council session had already begun without him, the long table filled with lords and ladies wrapped in furs, sipping warmed wine as if the world outside their windows was perfectly calm. Lord Gareth Price sat at the head of the table in Edmund's usual seat, a position he had slowly claimed over the past year while Edmund recovered from his injury. Price was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never been mocked for anything in his life. "Ah, the Duke has decided to join us," Price said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "We were beginning to wonder if you had gotten lost on your way down the hall." A few quiet laughs rippled around the table. Edmund ignored them and lowered himself carefully into the nearest chair, setting his cane against the table's edge. "The tide pulled back tonight further than anyone has seen it in decades," Edmund said, cutting straight past the pleasantries. "I need the council to authorize an evacuation of the lower docks and the eastern shore homes immediately." Silence fell over the table for a moment before Lady Cordelia, an older noblewoman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, let out a short laugh. "An evacuation, based on a tide." "Based on my father's writings, and what I saw with my own eyes an hour ago," Edmund said. Price leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Your father, may his memory rest peacefully, spent his final years convinced the sea was speaking to him personally. I remember the stories well. Are we now to build our policies on a dead man's fevered scribbles?" More laughter, louder this time. Edmund felt heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment but from frustration. He had expected resistance. He had not expected them to dismiss it so completely, so quickly, without even sending someone down to the docks to see for themselves. "Send a rider to the coast," Edmund said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "See it yourselves before you decide I have lost my mind." "We have grain shipments to discuss," Price said, waving a hand as if swatting away a fly. "Real matters for people capable of walking the docks themselves to inspect them properly." The comment landed exactly where Price intended it to land, a quiet blade aimed at Edmund's leg rather than his argument. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned, slowly and painfully over the past 3 years, that anger only gave men like Price more reasons to dismiss him. He rose from his chair anyway, gripping his cane, and left the hall without waiting for permission. Behind him, the conversation shifted seamlessly back to grain shipments, as though the warning had never been spoken at all. Outside the castle walls, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint smell of salt and something else underneath it, something metallic and strange that Edmund could not quite name. He stood at the top of the stone steps overlooking the town, watching smoke rise from chimneys as Ravenmore woke to another ordinary day, unaware of what its Duke had seen at the shoreline before sunrise. He thought about walking back down to the docks to check on the evacuation Corwin had started, but his leg throbbed with a deep, burning ache that told him he had already pushed it too far for one morning. Instead, he made his way slowly toward the eastern wall, where the old archive tower stood mostly forgotten, filled with his father's papers and journals that nobody else in the castle had bothered to read in years. If the council would not listen to him without proof, then he would find proof, even if it meant spending the rest of the day buried in dusty records nobody else cared about. He had spent 3 years being underestimated. He was not about to let pride stop him from doing whatever it took to save the people who lived below those castle walls, even the same people who had laughed at him more than once for the way he walked. As he reached the archive door, he paused, catching his breath against the stone frame. Down below, near the base of the hill, he noticed a young woman standing alone near the market stalls, watching the harbor with the same tense expression he had seen on Corwin's face just an hour earlier. She was not dressed like the merchants around her, and she stood apart from the small crowds gathering for the morning market, the way someone stands when they have learned that people prefer distance from them. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that she had noticed the same strange tide he had, or that she had spent her entire life reading the sea in a way that no noble in that council hall ever could. He only knew, in that brief moment before he pushed open the heavy archive door, that something in the way she stared at the water told him she understood exactly what he had seen that morning. Edmund stepped inside the tower, the door creaking shut behind him, and the cold silence of the archive swallowed him whole. Rows of shelves stretched into the darkness, packed with journals, maps, and records his father had collected obsessively in his final years, records everyone else in the castle considered worthless. He lit a single candle, set it on the reading table, and began pulling books from the shelves, searching for anything that might explain what he had seen. Outside, the wind continued to rise, whistling faintly through the narrow archive windows, as if the sea itself was trying to tell him something the rest of Ravenmore refused to hear. Somewhere below, in the town he had sworn to protect, the ordinary rhythm of life continued, untouched by warning, unaware that the hours ahead would test everything Edmund believed about trust, about pride, and about how easily people choose comfort over truth, even when the truth is standing right in front of them, leaning on a cane, asking only to be heard. Her name was Nora Finch, and she had learned long ago that Ravenmore did not forgive women who spoke their minds too loudly. 3 years earlier, she had stood in the town square and accused a respected merchant of selling spoiled grain to families who could not afford to travel elsewhere for food. She had been right. The grain had sickened a dozen children before anyone believed her. But instead of thanking her, the town had quietly pushed her to its edges, whispering that she was trouble, that she saw problems where none existed, that a young woman with no husband and no family name had no business questioning men of standing. Since then, Nora had lived alone in a small cottage near the eastern cliffs, earning her keep by mending nets and helping fishermen sort their catch before dawn. She kept to herself, spoke only when necessary, and watched the world with the careful, guarded eyes of someone who had learned that trust was a luxury she could rarely afford. That morning she had woken earlier than usual, pulled from sleep by a feeling she could not quite explain, a heaviness in the air that pressed against her chest like a held breath. When she stepped outside her cottage and looked toward the shoreline, she saw the same strange, retreating tide that had pulled Edmund from his study hours earlier. She had seen something like this once before, as a child, in a small fishing village far along the coast where her family had lived before moving to Ravenmore. She had been very young, but she remembered the way the adults around her had gone quiet and pale, remembered being pulled indoors and told to stay away from the windows. She did not remember much else, only fragments, but the memory carried a weight that made her skin prickle now. She made her way down to the market early, drawn by some instinct to be near people, near information, near anything that might explain the wrongness she felt in her bones. That was where she stood when she noticed the Duke, leaning heavily on his cane at the top of the hill, staring down at the harbor with the same troubled expression she imagined was on her own face. She had heard the rumors about Duke Edmund Hale, of course. Everyone in Ravenmore had. The accident that shattered his leg. The father who had supposedly lost his mind before his death, filling journals with warnings nobody could make sense of. The way the court had slowly stripped him of authority, piece by piece, while pretending it was simply out of concern for his health. Nora had never spoken to him directly, had never expected to, given how carefully nobles avoided association with people like her. But that morning, something pulled her feet toward the castle steps instead of away from them. She found him in the old archive tower an hour later, after asking a guard where the Duke had gone and receiving only a confused shrug in response. The tower door was slightly open, candlelight flickering faintly from within. She hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to knock or simply leave, when Edmund's voice reached her from somewhere among the shelves. "If you are here to laugh at me as well, you will need to wait your turn. There is a line forming." Nora almost smiled despite herself. She stepped inside, letting the heavy door close behind her. "I am not here to laugh, my lord." Edmund looked up from the table where he sat surrounded by open books, his expression shifting from weary irritation to cautious surprise. He recognized her, though he could not immediately place from where, until the memory surfaced of the young woman standing near the market stalls earlier that morning, watching the tide with the same troubled look he had worn himself. "You were at the harbor," he said. "Watching the water." "I was," Nora said. "I have seen it do that before, a long time ago, in a village I lived in as a child. My family left before I understood what it meant, but I remember how frightened everyone became." Edmund straightened in his chair, waving toward the empty seat across from him. "Please, sit. Tell me everything you remember, even the smallest detail. Nobody else in this castle is willing to listen, and I am beginning to run out of patience for people who refuse to open their eyes." Nora hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and sitting down. She had spent 3 years being dismissed by people with far less reason to listen than the Duke apparently had. Something about the desperation in his voice, the genuine need rather than performance, made her decide to trust him, at least for now. She told him what little she remembered. The tide pulling back too far, exposing the seabed in a way that frightened the fishermen. The adults gathering children indoors, boarding windows, moving livestock to higher ground. And then, hours later, a wall of water rising from the horizon, taller than any wave she had seen since, crashing into the village with a force that swept away homes built too close to the shore. Her family had survived only because her father, a cautious man by nature, had already begun moving them inland at the first sign of trouble, refusing to wait for anyone's permission or explanation. Edmund listened without interrupting, his hands pressed together, his eyes fixed on the flickering candle between them. When she finished, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of wind against the tower's narrow windows. "My father wrote about something similar," Edmund finally said, sliding one of the open journals across the table toward her. "He called it the pulling tide, said it happened once before, generations ago, long before either of us were born. He tried to warn the council about patterns he noticed in the years before his death, changes in the birds, the fish, the wells. Nobody listened. They said grief had broken his mind after my mother passed." Nora studied the page in front of her, filled with cramped, urgent handwriting, sketches of tide patterns, notes about well water turning bitter, birds abandoning the cliffs weeks before storms that never seemed to come on schedule. It read less like the ramblings of a broken man, and more like the careful observations of someone desperately trying to piece together a warning nobody wanted to hear. "He was not wrong," Nora said quietly. "Whatever this is, it is not new. It has happened before somewhere to someone, and it seems it may be happening again." Edmund exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "The council refused to even send someone to look at the shoreline. Lord Price made it very clear that my opinion carries little weight these days." "Then we do not need the council," Nora said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Not yet. We gather proof first. Real proof, not old journals they can dismiss as a dead man's grief. If the wells are turning bitter, we test the wells. If the birds are leaving, we count them ourselves. Give them nothing to laugh at." Edmund studied her for a long moment, something like relief passing behind his eyes. For 3 years, every attempt he made to raise concerns had been met with polite dismissal disguised as concern for his health, or open mockery disguised as honesty. Nobody had offered to help him build a case. They had only offered pity or scorn or silence. "Why would you help me with this?" he asked. "You do not know me, and associating with me will not exactly improve your standing in this town." Nora's mouth curved into a small, humorless smile. "My standing in this town could not get much lower, my lord. I have very little left to lose, and I have watched enough people suffer because those in power refused to listen to warnings that came from the wrong sort of person. If I can help stop that from happening again, I intend to try." They spent the rest of that morning inside the archive tower, poring over Edmund's father's old records, cross-referencing tide patterns with weather logs kept by the harbor master decades earlier. Nora proved sharper with numbers than Edmund expected, quickly spotting patterns in the old data that he had overlooked entirely. Connections between unusually warm winters and the pulling tides his father described. By midday, they had a working theory, still incomplete, but far more solid than anything Edmund could have presented to the council alone. They agreed to split their efforts. Edmund would continue searching the archives for anything else his father had documented, while Nora would visit the wells scattered along the eastern edge of town, testing the water herself and speaking quietly with fishermen who trusted her more than they trusted anyone wearing a noble's crest. As Nora made her way down from the castle that afternoon, she found herself glancing back once toward the archive tower, where she could just make out Edmund's silhouette still bent over his father's journals. For the first time in 3 years, She felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her usual caution, a fragile sense of purpose she had not expected to feel again. She reached the first well near the eastern market just as the afternoon sun began slipping behind gathering clouds. She lowered a small cup on a rope, drew water from the depths, and brought it to her lips carefully, tasting only a small amount at first. The bitterness hit her immediately, sharp and unmistakable, nothing like the clean water she remembered drinking from that same well only weeks earlier. She straightened, her pulse quickening, and looked out toward the harbor, where the tide had begun creeping back in, slow and deceptively calm, as if nothing at all had happened that morning. But Nora knew better now. Somewhere beneath that calm surface, something was building, and very few people in Ravenmore seemed willing to notice before it was far too late. She turned and began walking briskly back toward the castle, the bitter taste still lingering on her tongue, carrying with her the first piece of proof that would either save her town or condemn her, alongside a crippled Duke nobody wanted to believe, to the same ridicule that had already cost them both so much. By the time Nora returned to the castle, dusk had settled over Ravenmore, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple that made the sea below look almost peaceful. She found Edmund exactly where she had left him, though the pile of journals beside him had grown considerably taller, and a second candle now burned low on the table. "The well near the eastern market has turned bitter," she said, setting down a small clay jar she had filled with the tainted water. "I checked 2 others on my way back. Both showed the same signs, though not as strong yet." Edmund took the jar, held it up to the candlelight, and studied the faint discoloration in the liquid. "My father wrote about this exact symptom. He believed it happened when seawater pushed into the underground channels that feed our wells, weeks or even months before a larger disturbance struck the coast. He called it a warning the land gives before the sea takes something back." "Then we have proof," Nora said, "proof the council cannot simply laugh away." Edmund's expression grew heavier. "Lord Price will find a way to laugh at anything that threatens his position. But you are right. This is more than we had this morning. We need more, though, if we want to force an evacuation before the council even considers listening. We need to understand exactly what is coming and when." He gestured toward a locked door at the far end of the archive tower, barely visible in the flickering candlelight. "There is a restricted section beyond that door, records from my grandfather's time, sealed away after a disaster nobody in this castle likes to speak about. I have never been permitted access, even as Duke. My father tried for years to have it unsealed and was refused every time." Nora studied the door, an old iron lock rusted from disuse but clearly still functional. Why would anyone seal away information that could save lives? "Because the disaster my grandfather oversaw was blamed partly on decisions the Crown made at the time," Edmund said quietly. "Records that embarrass the family name have a tendency to disappear behind locked doors in this castle. I have always suspected there is far more written down about these pulling tides than my father ever managed to find on his own." Nora crossed the room and crouched beside the lock, examining it carefully with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years repairing fishing equipment with limited tools and even less patience for waiting on permission. "I can open this." Edmund raised an eyebrow. "You are certain that is wise? If we are caught breaking into sealed royal archives, it will not matter how much proof we gather. Price will use it to have us both removed from any position of influence entirely." "We are already being mocked and dismissed," Nora said simply. "The only difference now is whether we do so with information or without it." Edmund considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Do it." Nora produced a thin metal tool from the small pouch at her belt, one she had used countless times to repair locks on fishing crates and storage sheds along the docks. It took several minutes of careful, patient work, her ear pressed close to the mechanism, listening for the faint clicks that told her she was making progress. Edmund watched in quiet admiration, surprised by the steady focus she brought to the task, so different from the desperate, chaotic energy he had expected from someone doing something forbidden for the first time. Finally, the lock gave way with a soft click, and the heavy door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. They descended carefully, Edmund gripping the stone wall for support with one hand and his cane in the other, each step sending sharp reminders of pain shooting through his hip. Nora walked slightly ahead, holding the candle high, its flickering light casting long shadows across ancient stone walls lined with sealed crates and forgotten shelves. At the bottom, they found a small chamber filled with records far older than anything upstairs, some written in a script Edmund could barely decipher, others more recent, detailing events from his grandfather's reign that had clearly been deliberately hidden from public record. Edmund pulled a thick, leather-bound journal from the nearest shelf, blowing a layer of dust from its cover before opening it carefully. Inside, page after page detailed a disaster that had struck Ravenmoor's coast nearly 60 years earlier, describing the same pulling tide, the same bitter wells, the same birds abandoning the cliffs weeks before catastrophe arrived in the form of a massive wave that destroyed nearly a third of the town. "Hundreds died," Edmund read aloud, his voice tightening with each word. "My grandfather knew the signs beforehand according to this. A fisherman warned him, much like Corwin warned me this morning, and he refused to act quickly enough, worried about the cost of evacuating unnecessarily and damaging trade relationships with neighboring ports. By the time he ordered evacuation, it was already too late for hundreds of families living along the eastern shore." Nora took the journal gently from his hands, scanning the pages herself, her expression darkening with each line. "This is exactly what is happening now. The pattern is identical." "Then we know what is coming," Edmund said, "and roughly how much time we might have before it arrives. According to my grandfather's records, the wells began turning bitter almost 3 weeks before the wave struck, if our timeline follows the same pattern. We have less than 3 weeks to convince a council that already thinks you are unwell, and now apparently thinks I am nothing more than a troublemaker helping you," Nora finished grimly. A sudden sound from the staircase above made them both freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing down the stone steps toward the chamber. Edmund quickly closed the journal and pressed it against his chest, while Nora blew out the candle, plunging them into near-total darkness broken only by a faint torchlight spilling down from the stairwell above. "Who goes there?" a gruff voice called out, followed by the unmistakable sound of a sword being drawn from its sheath. Edmund straightened despite the pain in his leg, his voice carrying an authority he rarely bothered to use anymore. "It is Duke Edmund Hale." "Lower your weapon." The footsteps paused, followed by a long moment of confused silence before a young guard appeared at the base of the stairs, his torch illuminating the small chamber and revealing Edmund and Nora standing among the scattered records. "My lord," the guard stammered, clearly caught between confusion and alarm. "This section is sealed. Nobody is permitted access, not even members of the council, without direct authorization from the Crown." "I am the Crown," Edmund said firmly, though the words felt strange in his mouth after years of being treated as anything but. "And I have found information here that may save this entire town from a disaster that struck 60 years ago under nearly identical circumstances. I need you to trust me on this." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking uncertainly between Edmund and Nora, clearly recognizing her as well and clearly uncertain what to make of the situation. "My lord, if Lord Price learns that this section was accessed without authorization, then Lord Price can explain to the families of Ravenmoor why he chose politics over their lives," Edmund said, his voice hardening. "What is your name?" "Daniel, my lord, Daniel Ashworth." "Daniel, I need you to keep this discovery quiet for now, until we have gathered enough evidence to present properly to the council. Can I trust you with that?" Daniel glanced once more at the scattered journals, at the exposed staircase, at the desperate sincerity in his duke's expression, and slowly sheathed his sword. "My family has lived along the eastern shore for 3 generations, my lord. If there is any truth to what you are saying, I would rather help than hinder it." Relief washed over Edmund, small but meaningful, the first crack of genuine support from someone outside his immediate circle. "Thank you, Daniel. We may need your help again before this is finished." Daniel nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in his expression, and offered to help carry the most important journals back upstairs before resealing the chamber door as best he could, hoping to avoid drawing attention from anyone patrolling the upper floors. As they climbed back up the narrow staircase, Nora glanced sideways at Edmund, studying the determined set of his jaw despite the visible strain each step placed on his injured leg. "You did not hesitate," she said quietly. "Down there when the guard found us. You did not panic." "I have spent 3 years being told I am too broken to matter," Edmund said. "I have grown rather tired of proving people right." They emerged back into the main archive room just as the last light of dusk faded completely from the narrow windows, replaced by the soft glow of stars scattered across a clear night sky. A deceptive calm stretched over a town that had no idea how little time it truly had left. Edmund set the journals carefully on the reading table, arranging them alongside his father's notes, and the small jar of bitter well water Nora had collected earlier that day. Together, piece by piece, they were assembling something the council could not simply laugh away, though Edmund knew from painful experience that Lord Price would search for any excuse, however small, to dismiss even the strongest evidence if it threatened his growing influence over Ravenmore's affairs. "We need more wells tested," Nora said, already thinking ahead. "And someone should count the birds along the cliffs, compare it against normal numbers. If we can show a pattern building each day, it becomes much harder to dismiss as coincidence." "I will speak with Corwin in the morning," Edmund said. "He trusted me enough to evacuate the lower docks today. Perhaps he will trust me enough to help gather more evidence before we bring this back to the council." Nora studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind her tired eyes. "Why do you keep pushing this, my lord? You could simply let the council believe what they wish, protect what little standing you have left, and hope the danger passes without your involvement." Edmund considered the question seriously before answering. "Because I watched my father die believing nobody would ever listen to him, convinced until his final breath that he had failed the people he was supposed to protect. I refuse to make the same mistake, even if it costs me everything the council has left me to lose." Nora said nothing in response, but something in her expression softened slightly, a quiet understanding passing between them that neither felt the need to put into words. Outside the tower windows, the sea continued its slow, deceptive calm, hiding whatever it was building beneath the surface, while inside, 2 people the town had chosen to overlook worked quietly through the night, gathering the proof that might be the only thing standing between Ravenmore and the same devastating fate that had struck it 60 years before. 3 days passed in a blur of quiet, careful work. Corwin agreed to help gather more evidence, recruiting a handful of trusted fishermen to monitor the wells and record the tide patterns each morning before the market crowds arrived. Daniel Ashworth, true to his word, kept the archive discovery quiet, occasionally slipping away from his guard duties to help carry additional records up from the sealed chamber below. And Nora spent every spare hour counting birds along the eastern cliffs, tracking their numbers against notes her father had once kept during her childhood, notes she had carried with her through every move since leaving that first devastated village. By the 4th morning, the evidence had grown substantial. 7 wells now showed clear signs of bitterness, spreading steadily westward from the coast. The bird population along the eastern cliffs had dropped by nearly half, and the tide, while returning to something resembling normal each day, pulled back further each night than it had the night before, a slow, steady pattern that matched almost exactly the timeline described in Edmund's grandfather's sealed journal. Edmund called for an emergency session of the full council, a right he still technically held despite Price's steady erosion of his practical authority. The great hall filled quickly, nobles murmuring among themselves, curious what could possibly justify such an unusual request from a duke most of them had grown accustomed to ignoring. Nora stood near the back of the hall, uninvited but unwilling to let Edmund face this moment entirely alone. Several nobles glanced at her with open disapproval, whispering behind raised hands, clearly uncomfortable with her presence in a space typically reserved for people of far higher standing. Edmund stood at the head of the table, his cane steady beneath his weight, the collected evidence spread carefully before him. Lord Price sat directly across from him, arms crossed, an expression of practiced patience masking what Edmund suspected was genuine irritation at having his morning interrupted. 3 weeks ago, my father's warnings about a pulling tide would have sounded like nothing more than grief speaking through an old man's fears, Edmund began, forcing steadiness into his voice despite the weight of every eye in the room settling upon him. Today, I stand before you with proof that this pattern is real, that it has happened before, and that it is happening again right now, along our own coastline. He walked the council through the evidence methodically, presenting the bitter well samples, the careful bird counts Nora had gathered, the tide measurements Corwin's fishermen had recorded each morning, and finally, the sealed journal from his grandfather's reign describing the disaster that had struck Ravenmore 60 years earlier under nearly identical circumstances. For a moment, silence held the hall, and Edmund allowed himself a fragile flicker of hope that perhaps, finally, they would listen. Then Lord Price began to laugh. It was not a loud laugh, nor an especially cruel one at first, simply a low, dismissive chuckle that rippled outward through the hall as other nobles picked up on his lead, uncertain laughter growing bolder with each passing second. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Price said, wiping a mock tear from the corner of his eye, "but you have just presented us with jars of dirty well water, a handful of missing birds, and a book stolen from a sealed archive that was locked away for good reason, decades before either of us were born. Is this truly the foundation you wish to build an evacuation upon?" The archive was sealed to protect the Crown's reputation, not because the information within it was false, Edmund said, his voice hardening. "My grandfather ignored these same warnings and hundreds of people died as a result. I am trying to prevent that mistake from repeating itself." "Or," Price said smoothly, gesturing toward Nora at the back of the hall, "you have allowed yourself to be led astray by a young woman with a well-documented history of stirring panic in this town, whose accusations against a respected merchant 3 years ago nearly caused a riot before proving to be wildly overstated." Whispers spread quickly through the hall, heads turning to stare openly at Nora now, her cheeks burning under the sudden weight of attention. Edmund felt anger flare hot and sharp in his chest, sharper than anything he had felt in months. "Her warning about that grain was correct," Edmund said firmly. "Children fell ill because nobody listened to her the first time. I would think this council might have learned something from that experience, rather than repeating the same mistake with a far greater cost attached." "The grain incident was unfortunate," Price conceded, his tone still maddeningly calm. "But it hardly compares to demanding the evacuation of half our eastern shore based on the ramblings of a dead man's journal, and the observations of 2 people this council has already shown little reason to trust." Lady Cordelia leaned forward, studying Edmund with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic, though her words carried no less weight for it. "Your Grace, I understand you believe what you are telling us. But you are asking this council to disrupt hundreds of lives, halt trade along our busiest port, and spend resources we cannot easily recover, based on evidence that, forgive me, remains circumstantial at best." "How much evidence would satisfy you?" Edmund asked, frustration bleeding into his voice despite his effort to remain composed. "The wave itself, arriving to prove me correct after it has already destroyed everything we were trying to save." "Perhaps," Price said coldly, "we simply require evidence gathered by someone whose judgment this council still trusts. No offense intended, Your Grace, but between your father's documented decline before his death and your own recent struggles, it is not unreasonable for this council to seek a second opinion before acting on your recommendations alone." The words landed exactly as intended, a quiet, devastating blow disguised as reasonable caution. Edmund felt the hall's collective gaze shift subtly, sympathy mixing uncomfortably with doubt, the same doubt that had followed him relentlessly since his accident 3 years earlier. I will not apologize for trying to protect this town, Edmund said quietly, even if this council prefers comfort to caution. Nobody is asking you to apologize, Price said, rising smoothly from his seat. I am simply proposing that, given the significant weight of this decision, authority over coastal emergency matters be temporarily transferred to myself and Lady Cordelia. Until such time as more definitive evidence can be gathered by parties, this council trusts more fully. A murmur of agreement spread through the hall, heads nodding, quiet relief passing across several faces at the prospect of avoiding the disruption Edmund's warnings threatened to cause. Edmund opened his mouth to object, but before he could speak, Nora's voice rang out clearly from the back of the hall. You would rather protect your trade routes than protect the families living along that shore, she said, stepping forward despite the shocked murmurs rippling around her. I have lost everything once already to a warning nobody wanted to believe. I watched a village disappear beneath a wave because the men in charge decided caution was too expensive. I will not stand quietly while the same mistake happens here. You are not a member of this council, Price said sharply, his patience finally cracking. You have no standing to address this hall at all. Then give me standing, Nora said, her voice steady despite the flush rising in her cheeks. Send someone, anyone, down to those wells yourselves. Count the birds along the cliffs with your own eyes. If I am wrong, punish me however you see fit. But if I am right, and you have wasted these last precious days arguing about my standing in this hall instead of saving lives, that failure will belong to every person sitting at this table. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across several faces around the council table, a crack in the collective dismissal that had greeted Edmund's warning only moments before. But Price recovered quickly, his expression settling back into practiced calm. Guards, he said evenly, please escort this young woman from the hall. She has no place here, and her presence only serves to further undermine the seriousness this council deserves. Two guards stepped forward, hesitating only briefly before moving toward Nora. Daniel Ashworth stood among them, his jaw tight, clearly uncomfortable with the order but unwilling to openly defy his commanding officers in front of the full council. There is no need for guards, Nora said, straightening her shoulders with quiet dignity. I will leave on my own. She turned, meeting Edmund's eyes briefly across the crowded hall, a silent exchange passing between them that needed no words. Then she walked out, her steps steady despite the humiliation burning beneath her calm exterior, leaving behind a hall filled with whispers and the quiet, suffocating weight of dismissal. The council formally voted moments later, stripping Edmund of emergency authority over coastal matters, and transferring it to Price and Lady Cordelia, citing concerns over his judgment and the unreliable nature of the evidence he had presented. Edmund stood silently through the vote, his hands gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to remain composed even as 3 years of careful, patient effort collapsed around him in a matter of minutes. When the session finally ended, the nobles filed out slowly, murmuring among themselves, some casting sympathetic glances toward Edmund, others avoiding his gaze entirely. Price lingered near the door, offering Edmund a final, almost pitying smile before departing. This is not personal, Your Grace, Price said quietly. I simply believe this town deserves leadership it can trust completely, without doubt clouding every decision. Edmund said nothing, watching him leave, the weight of failure settling heavily in his chest, despite his certainty that the danger remained just as real as it had been that morning, regardless of what the council chose to believe. He found Nora waiting outside the castle gates, sitting on a low stone wall overlooking the town below, her expression carefully neutral despite everything that had just happened inside the hall. They stripped my authority, Edmund said, lowering himself carefully onto the wall beside her. Price and Lady Cordelia control coastal matters now. I assumed as much, Nora said quietly. I am sorry, I did not help matters storming in the way I did. You spoke the truth, Edmund said. That is more than this council has managed in years. They sat together in silence for a long moment, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the calm, deceptive sea below in soft shades of gold and orange. Somewhere beneath that peaceful surface, the countdown continued, indifferent to council votes and wounded pride, indifferent to whether Ravenmore chose to listen before it was too late. "We are not finished," Edmund said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "If the council will not act, we act ourselves, quietly, carefully, without their permission if necessary. I will not let pride, mine or theirs, cost this town the lives it stands to lose." Nora turned to look at him, something like fragile hope flickering behind her tired eyes for the first time since walking out of that hall. "Then we had better move quickly, my lord. According to your grandfather's journal, we may have less time than we think." They began that same evening, working in the dim light of Edmund's study, with a map of Ravenmore spread across the desk between them. Without official authority, they could not order an evacuation or command resources from the castle stores. What they could do, quietly and carefully, was prepare the people willing to listen, one household at a time, without drawing the attention of a council eager for any excuse to silence them further. Corwin proved invaluable in those early days, using his standing among the fishing families to spread careful, measured warnings without triggering the kind of panic that might draw Price's attention too quickly. He spoke to trusted friends first, urging them to quietly move valuables and important supplies to higher ground, framing it as ordinary caution rather than the urgent evacuation Edmund believed it truly needed to be. Daniel Ashworth helped where he could as well, though his position as a castle guard limited how openly he could assist without risking his own standing. He began mapping safe routes inland from the eastern shore, identifying which paths remained clear during heavy rain and which tended to flood, information that would prove critical if they needed to move large numbers of people quickly once the true danger arrived. Nora spent her days moving between the fishing families and the small merchant stalls along the lower market, her reputation as a troublemaker working strangely in her favor now, since people already accustomed to dismissing official warnings found her quiet, urgent counsel somehow more believable than anything spoken from the castle steps. She had lived among them, suffered alongside them, and unlike the nobles safely distant in their stone halls, she would be standing on that same shore if the wave truly came. 6 days after the council stripped Edmund of his authority, the first tremor struck. It came without warning, shortly after midnight, a deep, rolling shudder that rattled windows and sent dishes crashing from shelves throughout the lower town. Edmund felt it first as a strange vibration beneath his feet while reviewing tide records in his study, followed almost immediately by a low, distant rumble that seemed to rise up from the earth itself rather than descend from the sky above. He grabbed his cane and made his way toward the window as quickly as his leg allowed, watching as lanterns flickered to life across the town below, doors flying open as frightened families spilled into the streets, uncertain what had just happened or whether it might happen again. The tremor lasted only a few seconds, but its effects lingered far longer. Several older buildings along the lower docks suffered cracked walls and collapsed chimneys. A section of the harbor wall, already weakened by years of neglect, crumbled partially into the water, though thankfully no one had been standing near it at the time. By morning, the town buzzed with frightened speculation, and for the first time, Edmund noticed a subtle shift in how people spoke about his earlier warnings. The tremor matched almost exactly a passage from his grandfather's journal, describing similar shocks in the weeks before the wave struck 60 years earlier. Small warnings the earth itself provided before the sea delivered its final, devastating blow. Corwin found Edmund at the harbor shortly after dawn, surveying the damaged wall with a grim expression. "People are asking questions now, my lord. The ones who laughed loudest at your warning last week are suddenly far quieter this morning." "Questions will not save them if the council refuses to act," Edmund said. "We need this moment. If people are frightened enough to listen, we cannot waste the opportunity." Word of the tremor reached the castle quickly, and within hours, Lord Price called an emergency session of his own, though notably without inviting Edmund to attend, given his official removal from coastal authority. Edmund learned of the meeting secondhand through Daniel, who reported that Price had dismissed the tremor as an unrelated geological event, unconnected to Edmund's earlier warnings, insisting that panic, not preparation, remained the greater danger facing Ravenmore. "He is protecting his position," Nora said bitterly when Edmund shared the news later that day. "Admitting the tremor supports your warning would mean admitting he was wrong to strip your authority in the first place." "Then we continue without him," Edmund said. "We do not need the Council's permission to prepare shelters and stockpile supplies. We simply need enough people willing to trust us before it is too late." Over the following days, their quiet preparations accelerated. Using funds from his own personal accounts, separate from the castle treasury, Price now controlled, Edmund purchased grain, blankets, and medical supplies, storing them carefully in a series of caves along the inland hills that Daniel had identified as safe from flooding. Nora organized rotating groups of trusted fishing families to help transport supplies after dark, avoiding the main roads where castle guards loyal to Price might notice and report their activities. It was slow, careful work, made more difficult by the constant awareness that discovery could end everything. Price had made it clear that further defiance from Edmund would not be tolerated quietly, and rumors began circulating that he was considering having Edmund formally examined by castle physicians, questioning his mental fitness to hold his title at all. Despite the risk, more people began quietly seeking Edmund and Nora out, families who had felt the tremor and could no longer ignore the growing unease settling over the town. An elderly woman named Margaret, who had survived the original disaster 60 years earlier as a young child, sought Edmund out personally one evening, her weathered hands trembling as she described memories she had spent decades trying to forget. "The tremors came first," she told him, sitting in his study with a cup of warm tea cradled in her hands. "3 of them, each one closer together than the last. My mother knew what they meant, though nobody would listen to her either. She moved us inland herself, dragging me by the hand while our neighbors laughed at her foolishness. We were the only family from our street who survived." Her testimony, delivered with quiet, aching sincerity, gave Edmund something even more valuable than his grandfather's journal, a living witness whose memory could not be dismissed as circumstantial evidence or the ramblings of a grieving mind. He began recording her account carefully, along with the accounts of 2 other elderly residents Nora managed to locate, survivors who had never spoken publicly about that night, their memories buried beneath decades of silence and unspoken grief. "If Price refuses to listen to living witnesses, he leaves this council no excuse at all," Edmund said, reviewing the collected testimonies late one night, exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes. "He will still find an excuse," Nora said quietly. "Men like Price always do, but it will grow harder for others on that council to follow him blindly with this much evidence stacked against his position." 2 more tremors struck over the following week, each slightly stronger than the last, exactly as Margaret had described from her own childhood memory. The town's unease deepened with each shock, though Price continued publicly dismissing any connection to Edmund's earlier warnings, insisting instead that the castle's engineers were investigating unrelated structural concerns beneath the harbor. Behind closed doors, however, cracks were beginning to show in the council's unified front. Lady Cordelia, whose skepticism had helped strip Edmund of his authority in the first place, quietly sent a servant to Edmund's study late one night, requesting a private meeting away from Price's watchful attention. She arrived cloaked and hooded, clearly anxious about being seen, and settled into the chair across from Edmund's desk with visible discomfort. "I have felt 3 tremors in as many weeks, Your Grace, and I have watched the harbor wall crumble a little further each day. I find myself less certain than I once was." "What would convince you fully?" Edmund asked carefully, unwilling to let hope override caution after everything the council had already put him through. "Show me the wells yourself," Cordelia said. "Not through jars carried into a council hall, but let me see them with my own eyes, taste the water myself, and speak with the fishermen directly. If what you claim proves true, I will use whatever influence I still hold to challenge Price's authority over this matter. It was a small opening, fragile and uncertain, but after weeks of dismissal and ridicule, it felt like the first genuine crack in the wall Price had built around Ravenmore's leadership. Edmund agreed immediately, arranging for Nora to guide Lady Cordelia personally through the eastern wells the following morning, away from the prying eyes of Price's most loyal supporters. That night, as Edmund prepared for what he hoped might finally be a turning point, a messenger arrived breathless at his study door, interrupting his careful review of Margaret's testimony. "My lord," the young messenger gasped, "Lord Price has learned of the supply caves in the eastern hills. He has sent guards to seize everything you have stockpiled, calling it unauthorized use of castle land and a direct violation of his authority over coastal matters." Edmund's stomach dropped, cold dread replacing the fragile hope Lady Cordelia's visit had briefly inspired. Weeks of careful, quiet preparation threatened now with complete collapse at the worst possible moment, just as the true danger continued building beneath the deceptively calm surface of the sea. He grabbed his cane, ignoring the sharp protest of pain in his leg, and made his way as quickly as he could toward Nora's cottage, knowing that whatever came next would determine not only their fragile alliance's survival, but potentially the survival of everyone in Ravenmore who had finally begun, however cautiously, to trust them. Nora was already awake when Edmund arrived at her cottage, pulling on her cloak with quick, practiced movements, having received word of the seizure from one of the fishing families only minutes earlier. "They are already at the caves," she said, not bothering with greetings. "We need to move now if we hope to save anything." They made their way toward the eastern hills as quickly as Edmund's leg allowed, guided by moonlight and the distant flicker of torches marking the guards' position near the supply caves. By the time they arrived, breathless and exhausted, they found Price himself standing among a dozen armed guards, watching calmly as sacks of grain and crates of medical supplies were loaded onto waiting carts. "Your Grace," Price said, feigning surprise at Edmund's arrival, though his tone carried no real warmth. "I did not expect you to make the journey personally, given your condition." "These supplies belong to me," Edmund said, forcing steadiness into his voice despite the burning exhaustion in his leg. "Purchased with my own funds, stored on land that remains under my personal authority regardless of whatever powers this council has stripped from me. Ravenmore's coastal lands, including these hills, fall directly under my authority now, as this council decided," Price said smoothly. "Storing unauthorized stockpiles here without proper oversight raises troubling questions about your intentions, Your Grace. Some might call it hoarding resources meant for the entire town. Others might call it something far more concerning." "I am trying to save lives," Edmund said, anger bleeding into his voice despite his effort to remain composed. "Lives you seem far more interested in ignoring than protecting." "I am protecting this town from panic," Price said, his patience finally beginning to fray beneath his usual polished calm. "From reckless spending, unauthorized stockpiling, and a duke whose judgment this council has already questioned once. I would think, given the scrutiny already surrounding your fitness to lead, that you would exercise more caution rather than less." Nora stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer despite the guard's watchful presence. "You are stealing supplies meant to save families along that shore, simply to protect your own position. Everyone here can see exactly what this is." Price turned toward her, his expression hardening into something colder than Edmund had seen from him before. "You have caused enough disruption in this town, Miss Finch. I would advise you to remain silent, unless you wish to find yourself formally charged with theft of castle resources, alongside whatever unauthorized activity has been happening in these hills." "These supplies were purchased with the Duke's own money," Nora said, refusing to back down despite the guards shifting uneasily around them. "There is no theft here except the one you are currently committing." "Careful," Price warned, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "Accusations against a member of this council carry serious consequences, especially from someone with your particular history of stirring unrest in this town. The guards continued loading the carts throughout the tense exchange, indifferent to the argument unfolding around them, following orders that mattered far more to their livelihoods than the uncertain claims of a duke stripped of his authority. Within the hour, the supply cave stood empty, weeks of careful, quiet preparation swept away in a single coordinated seizure. As the carts began rolling back toward the castle, Price lingered a moment longer, studying Edmund with something that almost resembled genuine curiosity beneath his practiced disdain. "I understand grief clouds judgment, Your Grace. Losing your father, losing the full use of your body, it would be understandable if these losses left you searching desperately for purpose, even purpose built on shaky foundations. But I will not allow this town to suffer for your need to prove yourself capable of something more." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Edmund standing alone in the empty caves with Nora, the moonlight casting long shadows across shelves that had held weeks of careful preparation only hours earlier. "He is not wrong that I need to prove something," Edmund said quietly, once Price's footsteps had faded into the distance. "But he is very wrong about what that something is." Nora placed a steady hand on his arm, the gesture small but grounding amid the wreckage of their efforts. "We will find another way, we always have." But the following days brought little comfort. Word spread quickly through Ravenmore that Price had seized unauthorized supplies from the Duke, and rather than generating sympathy for Edmund's cause, the story twisted through gossip and speculation, until many in the town began viewing his actions as further evidence of instability rather than genuine concern. Price, meanwhile, used the incident to tighten his control further, formally requesting that castle physicians evaluate Edmund's mental fitness, a request the council approved despite Lady Cordelia's quiet objections. Edmund found himself increasingly isolated, watched closely by guards loyal to Price, his movements restricted under the guise of concern for his well-being. Nora, similarly, noticed unfamiliar faces lingering near her cottage in the days that followed, watching her comings and goings with unsettling attentiveness. "They are trying to separate us," Nora said one evening, meeting Edmund briefly in a quiet corner of the castle gardens, the only place they could speak without immediate observation. "If they isolate you inside the castle and keep me watched constantly, we lose any ability to continue preparing this town for what is coming." "Then we need to move faster than they expect," Edmund said. "Before the physicians arrive to evaluate me, before they find further reason to restrict either of us completely." That night, working by candlelight in his study, Edmund reviewed everything they had gathered, searching desperately for something that might force the council's hand before Price's growing control made further action impossible. His eyes fell upon Margaret's testimony, still sitting untouched on his desk since the night the supply caves were seized. An idea began forming, risky and uncertain, but perhaps the only option remaining. If the council would not listen to evidence presented quietly through proper channels, perhaps they needed to hear it directly from the survivors themselves, presented publicly, where dismissal would carry far greater political cost than Price currently anticipated. He sent word to Nora through Daniel, who remained quietly loyal despite the growing risk to his own position, arranging a plan to gather Margaret and the other elderly survivors for a public gathering in the town square, where ordinary residents, not just the council, could hear their testimony directly. The gathering was arranged for 2 nights later, timed carefully around the changing of castle guards to minimize the risk of interference from Price's most loyal supporters. Word spread quietly through trusted channels, fishing families, market vendors, and dock workers who had grown increasingly uneasy with each passing tremor, and each new bidder well discovered along the eastern shore. But on the evening of the gathering, as Edmund made his way carefully through the castle corridors toward the meeting point, he found his path blocked by 2 guards he did not recognize, their expressions carefully neutral despite the clear intent behind their positioning. "Lord Price has requested you remain within the castle tonight, Your Grace," one of them said. For your own safety, given the recent unrest in town. I am not a prisoner in my own castle, Edmund said sharply, though a cold, sinking dread had already begun settling in his chest. Those are our orders, my lord, the second guard said, his tone apologetic but firm. We would prefer not to use force, but we will if necessary. Edmund's mind raced, calculating options that grew fewer with each passing second. Without his presence, the gathering would lack the authority needed to force any real consideration from the council, regardless of how compelling Margaret's testimony might prove on its own. Meanwhile, across town, Nora arrived at the square earlier than planned, only to find Margaret's small cottage strangely quiet, the elderly woman nowhere to be found despite their earlier arrangement. A neighbor, wide-eyed with concern, explained that castle guards had visited Margaret's home just hours earlier, escorting her away under the pretense of a routine health inspection ordered by the council. Cold understanding settled over Nora immediately. Price had learned of their plan, likely through one of the many watchful eyes he had positioned throughout town, and had moved swiftly to remove their strongest witness before she could speak publicly. Nora made her way quickly toward the castle, her earlier caution abandoned entirely in favor of urgent necessity. She found the main gates heavily guarded, far more than usual, clearly anticipating exactly the kind of desperate approach she was currently attempting. I need to speak with Duke Edmund Hale, she said firmly to the guards blocking her path. It concerns a matter of immediate importance to the safety of this town. The Duke is unavailable this evening, one guard replied. His tone carrying an edge of practiced dismissal, she recognized immediately as Price's influence extending even to the smallest interactions within the castle walls. Then I need to speak with whoever is holding Margaret Wells, Nora pressed, refusing to be turned away so easily. She has done nothing wrong beyond agreeing to share memories that could save lives. The guard's expression flickered, something like discomfort passing briefly across his features before settling back into stern professionalism. I am not able to discuss castle matters with you, miss. I would advise you return home for the evening. Nora stood her ground for a long moment, weighing her limited options against the growing certainty that further argument would accomplish nothing beyond drawing additional unwanted attention to herself. Reluctantly, she turned and made her way back toward the town square, where a small but hopeful crowd had already begun gathering, expecting testimony that now seemed unlikely to arrive. She climbed onto the small stone platform normally used for market announcements, gathering her courage as dozens of curious faces turned toward her, some sympathetic, others openly skeptical given her reputation throughout town. The Duke and the witness we hoped would speak tonight have both been detained by the castle, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square despite the nervous tremor beneath her words. I cannot tell you their exact reasons, but I can tell you this. 3 tremors have shaken this town in as many weeks. 7 wells along the eastern shore have turned bitter. The birds that once filled our cliffs have nearly vanished entirely. These are not coincidences. They are warnings, the same warnings that came before the disaster that struck this town 60 years ago. A disaster this council would apparently prefer you forget ever happened. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertain but no longer entirely dismissive, given how many among them had personally felt the tremors and noticed the strange changes along the coastline in recent weeks. I cannot force this council to listen, Nora continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. But I can ask you, as neighbors, as people who have lived through hardship together in this town, to prepare yourselves regardless of what the council chooses to believe. Move what you can to higher ground. Keep your families close. Trust your own eyes, even when those in power refuse to trust theirs. As she finished speaking, uncertain applause rippled through parts of the crowd, though skepticism still lingered heavily among others unwilling to abandon their homes based on the word of a woman the town had spent years dismissing as trouble. Behind her, unnoticed in the gathering darkness, one of Price's guards had watched the entire gathering unfold, and by the time Nora climbed down from the platform, exhausted and uncertain whether her words had accomplished anything meaningful at all. That same guard was already making his way back toward the castle to report everything he had witnessed directly to Lord Price. Edmund spent that night pacing his chambers as best his leg allowed, the two guards stationed outside his door a constant, maddening reminder of how thoroughly Price had managed to isolate him. He had no way of knowing whether Nora had reached the square, whether Margaret had been found, or whether their carefully planned gathering had accomplished anything at all beyond further exposing them to Price's growing control. Sleep proved impossible. Around midnight, a soft knock at his window startled him from his restless thoughts. He crossed the room carefully and found Daniel Ashworth crouched on the narrow ledge outside. Having climbed up from the courtyard below using an old drainage pipe he had apparently used as a boy sneaking out of castle duties. "I do not have much time," Daniel whispered once Edmund had helped him through the window. "Margaret Wells is being held in the lower guest quarters, supposedly for a health evaluation ordered by Lord Price, though I suspect that is simply an excuse to keep her from speaking publicly. Nora addressed the town square alone tonight. From what I heard, she managed to plant some doubt, though many remain uncertain." "I need to reach the square myself," Edmund said, "or at least reach the council before Price buries this evidence entirely." Daniel hesitated, glancing back toward the door where the guards remained stationed. "There is a service passage behind the old kitchen stores that leads out near the eastern wall. It is narrow and the stairs are steep, but it should be clear of Price's men tonight, given how thin his forces have been stretched watching the town square." The stairs proved every bit as difficult as Daniel had warned, each step sending sharp waves of pain through Edmund's hip, but he pushed through it with grim determination, refusing to let his body's limitations cost him this final chance. By the time they emerged near the eastern wall, sweat had soaked through his shirt and his leg trembled with exhaustion, but he was free of the castle's confinement, at least for now. He found Nora near the harbor shortly before dawn, standing alone at the edge of the docks, staring out at water that had once again pulled back further than it should, exposing wide stretches of glistening sand beneath the pale, early light. "You came," she said, relief evident in her voice despite her obvious exhaustion. "I was not certain you would manage to escape their watch." "Daniel helped," Edmund said. "How did the gathering go?" "Some believed me. Many did not," Nora admitted. "But Margaret has been taken, held under the pretense of a health evaluation. Without her testimony, I fear we have lost whatever momentum we managed to build tonight." Before Edmund could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, far stronger than any of the previous tremors, sending both of them stumbling against the harbor railing for support. Somewhere behind them, a chimney collapsed with a heavy crash, and startled shouts began rising from the streets as sleeping families woke to the violent shaking. Edmund's eyes shot toward the horizon, where the pale morning light revealed something that made his blood run cold. Far out at sea, where calm water should have stretched toward the rising sun, a dark, growing line had begun forming instead, a wall of water building steadily larger as it moved toward shore with terrifying, silent speed. "It is happening," Edmund said, his voice tight with urgent dread. "Now, we do not have time to wait for the council's permission." He turned and began shouting immediately, his voice carrying across the docks with an authority that finally matched the desperate certainty he had carried for weeks. "The wave is coming. Everyone needs to move inland immediately now, leave everything behind and move." Confusion and panic rippled through the awakening streets as families spilled from their homes, uncertain whether to believe the frantic warning or dismiss it as further evidence of the Duke's supposed instability. But Corwin, already awake and preparing his boat for the morning catch, saw the growing line on the horizon himself and began shouting alongside Edmund, his voice carrying weight among the fishing families that Edmund's alone could not always achieve. "Move, everyone move now toward the hills. Do not stop for your belongings." The combination of Edmund's urgent authority and Corwin's trusted voice began cutting through the confusion, families grabbing children and elderly relatives, streaming away from the shoreline toward the inland paths Daniel had carefully mapped during their weeks of quiet preparation. Nora ran alongside Edmund, guiding confused families toward the safest routes, her earlier public testimony suddenly proving its worth as people who had heard her warning the night before moved with far less hesitation than those hearing the danger for the first time. Edmund's legs screamed with every step, but he pushed forward regardless, moving from house to house along the lower streets, banging on doors, pulling frightened residents from their homes with an urgency that left no room for his usual careful, measured pace. He found an elderly couple struggling to gather their belongings and forced them to abandon everything, half carrying the woman toward the inland path himself despite the agony radiating through his hip with every labored step. Meanwhile, word of the growing wave reached the castle quickly, and Lord Price, watching from the high windows of the great hall, felt genuine alarm creeping through his practiced composure for the first time in weeks. He had dismissed Edmund's warnings so thoroughly, so publicly, that the sight of the dark line growing steadily larger on the horizon left him momentarily frozen, uncertain how to reconcile what he was witnessing with everything he had insisted upon believing. "Sound the alarm bells," he finally ordered, his voice tight with rising panic. "Get the castle guards down to help with evacuation immediately." But precious minutes had already been lost, minutes that Edmund and Nora's earlier preparations, however incomplete, now worked desperately to reclaim. Guards streamed down from the castle, finally mobilizing under Price's belated orders, joining the chaotic effort to move Ravenmoor's remaining residents away from the rapidly approaching danger. Nora reached Margaret's cottage in the lower guest quarters just as guards there, uncertain what to do given the sudden crisis, began releasing residents from their supposed health evaluations without further question. She found the elderly woman frightened but unharmed, and together they made their way as quickly as Margaret's age allowed toward the inland paths, joining the growing stream of families fleeing the coastline. Edmund, meanwhile, had reached the lower docks, where a cluster of families remained frozen with indecision, unwilling to abandon fishing boats representing their entire livelihood despite the growing danger visible on the horizon. Among them stood young Daniel's own family, his mother clutching a small chest of savings while his younger siblings clung fearfully to her skirts. "There is no time," Edmund said, his voice raw with exhaustion and urgency. "Boats can be rebuilt, lives cannot." Something in his desperate sincerity finally broke through their hesitation, and the family abandoned their boat, following Edmund as he guided them toward the inland path, his cane nearly forgotten in his hand as adrenaline temporarily overpowered the searing pain in his leg. The wave grew visibly closer now, its low, building roar finally audible even over the chaos of the fleeing town, a sound unlike anything most residents had ever heard, deep and relentless, carrying with it the accumulated weight of everything the sea had been quietly building for weeks. Edmund reached the base of the inland path just as the last few families streamed past him, urging them forward with what remained of his strength. He turned back one final time, scanning the lower streets for any remaining stragglers, and spotted an elderly fisherman, injured and struggling alone near a collapsed section of dock, unable to move quickly enough to escape on his own. Without hesitation, Edmund abandoned the safety of the inland path and made his way back down toward the docks, ignoring Nora's shouted warning behind him, focused entirely on reaching the stranded man before the growing wave closed the remaining distance between them. He reached the fisherman just as the roar of the approaching water grew deafening, wrapping the man's arm around his shoulders and half dragging, half carrying him back toward the inland path, his leg buckling repeatedly beneath the combined weight and strain, pain no longer registering through the desperate focus consuming his entire body. They reached higher ground just as the wave finally crashed into the lower town behind them, a thunderous, overwhelming force that swept through empty streets and abandoned boats, destroying homes and docks that had stood along that shoreline for generations. Edmund collapsed to his knees at the top of the path, the injured fisherman safely beside him, both of them gasping for breath as they watched the devastation unfold below. Nora reached him moments later, dropping to the ground beside him, relief and exhaustion mixing freely across her face as she checked him carefully for injuries beyond his obviously trembling leg. "You went back," she said, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet awe. "After everything, you went back for one more person." "I could not leave him," Edmund said simply, still struggling to catch his breath. "Not when we had come this far to save everyone we could." Around them, the town's survivors gathered slowly along the ridge overlooking the devastated shoreline, watching in stunned silence as the water finally began retreating, leaving behind wreckage that told its own undeniable story. Homes destroyed, boats scattered and broken. But remarkably, given the scale of destruction, very few lives lost, thanks to the desperate, coordinated evacuation that Edmund and Nora's weeks of careful preparation had made possible in those final critical moments. Lord Price arrived at the ridge shortly after, his usual composure completely abandoned, his eyes wide with shock as he surveyed the destruction below alongside the survivors he had so recently dismissed and undermined. He found Edmund still seated on the ground, Nora beside him, surrounded by grateful families who had survived because two people the town had chosen to overlook refused to stop fighting for them, even when fighting cost them everything the council had left them to lose. The days following the wave passed in a haze of exhausted relief and quiet mourning. A handful of lives had still been lost, mostly among those who had refused to believe the warnings even as the water drew back from the shore, but the number remained a fraction of what Margaret's memories, and Edmund's grandfather's sealed journal, had described from the disaster 60 years earlier. Nearly everyone along the eastern shore had reached higher ground in time, an outcome that felt almost impossible given how close the council had come to ignoring the danger entirely. Lord Price found himself facing a very different council session than the one he had presided over weeks earlier. Lady Cordelia, who had witnessed the bitter wells firsthand alongside Nora just days before the wave struck, spoke first, her voice carrying none of the skepticism she had shown in earlier sessions. "We were given every warning necessary to prevent even greater loss," she said, addressing the assembled nobles with quiet gravity. "We chose comfort over caution and dismissed the very people whose careful observation ultimately saved this town." Price attempted, briefly, to defend his earlier decisions, citing the genuine uncertainty that had surrounded Edmund's initial claims. But the destruction visible from the castle windows made his arguments feel hollow, even to nobles who had readily agreed with him only weeks before. One by one, council members who had laughed loudest at Edmund's warnings now found themselves unable to meet his eyes across the same table where he had once been so thoroughly dismissed. Edmund, still recovering from the strain the evacuation had placed on his injured leg, addressed the council from a chair rather than standing, though his voice carried no less authority for it. "I do not share this to seek satisfaction in being proven correct," he said. "I share it because this town nearly paid a devastating price for choosing comfort over careful observation, for valuing appearances over the voices of people this council found easy to dismiss." He gestured toward Nora, seated quietly near the back of the hall, no longer standing apart from the gathering, but invited forward this time by Lady Cordelia herself. Nora Finch noticed the same warning signs I did, based on knowledge this council never bothered to ask about, memories from a childhood disaster she survived through her own family's caution. Her testimony, alongside Margaret Wells and the other survivors we located, provided evidence this council chose to dismiss simply, because it came from people without noble titles attached to their names. Murmurs of quiet agreement rippled through the hall, a striking contrast to the laughter that had greeted Edmund's warnings only weeks earlier. Lord Price, recognizing the shifting mood, rose from his seat with visible discomfort. "I acted based on the information available to me at the time," he said, though his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. "I will not pretend the outcome does not weigh heavily on my judgment." "Weighing heavily is not the same as taking responsibility," Edmund said quietly, though without the anger that might once have colored his words. "This town needs leadership willing to listen before disaster strikes, not leadership that only values caution after the cost has already been paid." The council ultimately voted to restore Edmund's full authority over coastal matters, with Lady Cordelia proposing additionally that Nora be granted a formal advisory position, recognizing the critical role her knowledge and courage had played in saving countless lives. Price, stripped of much of his influence following the vote, remained on the council but found his once considerable authority significantly diminished, the weight of his earlier dismissals following him through every future session. In the weeks that followed, Ravenmore slowly began rebuilding. Edmund threw himself into the recovery effort despite his leg's continued protest, organizing supplies, coordinating repairs, and ensuring that the families who had lost their homes received proper support from the castle's resources he now controlled without needing to fight for every decision. Nora worked alongside him constantly, no longer treated as an unwelcome outsider, but as someone whose judgment the town had learned, through painful experience, to value deeply. The same fishing families who had once whispered about her troublesome reputation now sought her counsel readily, grateful for the courage she had shown when speaking up mattered most. Margaret, recovered fully from her brief detention, became something of a quiet local hero herself, her testimony finally given the weight it deserved after decades of carrying memories nobody wanted to hear. She spent many afternoons in Edmund's study, helping him properly document the disaster's history alongside his father's and grandfather's records, ensuring that future generations of Ravenmore would never again dismiss such warnings so easily. One evening, several weeks after the wave, Edmund found Nora standing at the same harbor railing where they had stood together the morning the wave finally struck, watching the rebuilding efforts continue steadily along the shoreline below. The docks, though still damaged, showed clear signs of recovery, new wood replacing shattered planks, fishing boats slowly returning to the water under careful, watchful eyes. "You never told me why you truly decided to help me that first morning," Edmund said, settling carefully beside her, his cane resting against the railing. "Beyond simply recognizing the same warning signs I had seen myself." Nora considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I spent 3 years believing nobody would ever listen to me again, not after what happened with the grain. I had convinced myself that speaking up only led to further isolation, further loss. But watching you stand in that council hall, mocked and dismissed despite everything you had already suffered, I recognized something familiar in your determination to keep trying anyway." "And now," Edmund asked quietly, "now I believe that sometimes the people willing to listen most carefully are exactly the people everyone else has already decided to ignore," Nora said. "The outcasts, the overlooked. Perhaps we notice things others miss precisely because we have learned, through painful experience, how important it is to pay attention." Edmund studied her for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself in the 3 difficult years since his accident. "This town owes both of us a great deal, though I suspect you deserve far more credit than you have received." "We saved it together," Nora said simply. "That is enough for me." They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun began setting over the rebuilding harbor, casting warm golden light across water that had once threatened to destroy everything Ravenmore had built, but which now, slowly and carefully, was being reclaimed by people who had learned, through devastating experience, the true cost of dismissing those brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths. Lord Price, watching quietly from a distant window of the castle, observed the 2 figures standing together at the harbor railing, and for perhaps the first time since the disaster, allowed himself to fully acknowledge the mistake he had made in dismissing them so completely. Whatever influence he retained on the council, he understood now that true leadership required something he had failed to offer when it mattered most: the humility to listen, even to voices the rest of the world had already decided were not worth hearing. Ravenmore's recovery continued steadily through the following months, its people forever changed by how close they had come to repeating a devastating history nearly forgotten within their own records. And at the center of that recovery stood a crippled duke and the outcast who had trusted him, 2 people the town had once overlooked entirely, now standing together as the very reason Ravenmore still existed at all. A full year passed before Ravenmore truly felt like itself again, though its people would later say the town that rebuilt itself along that eastern shore was stronger, wiser, and far more attentive than the one the wave had swept away. New homes rose slightly further inland than before, built with the careful understanding that comfort should never again outweigh caution. The lower docks were rebuilt with sturdier foundations, and a series of watchtowers now stood along the coastline, manned continuously by volunteers trained to recognize the same warning signs that Edmund and Nora had once fought so hard to have believed. Edmund established a small council seat specifically dedicated to coastal observation, staffed permanently by fishermen, well keepers, and anyone willing to track the patterns the sea revealed to those patient enough to watch closely. Corwin took the lead role gladly, training younger fishermen in the careful art of reading tides, teaching them everything Edmund's father had documented decades earlier, knowledge that would no longer sit buried and dismissed within a sealed archive. Margaret lived long enough to see the new watchtowers completed, visiting them personally with quiet satisfaction, finally free of the burden she had carried alone for 60 years. When she passed peacefully the following spring, the entire town gathered to honor her, recognizing publicly what she had given them through her courage in finally speaking her memories aloud. Daniel Ashworth, promoted for his quiet loyalty during the crisis, eventually took charge of coordinating evacuation drills throughout the town, ensuring that if such a disaster ever threatened Ravenmore again, its people would move with practiced efficiency rather than confused panic. He often told newer guards the story of climbing that old drainage pipe to help free his duke from confinement, a small act of quiet defiance that had ultimately helped save hundreds of lives. Lord Price remained on the council for several more years, though his influence never fully recovered from the disaster's aftermath. He grew notably more cautious in his judgments, more willing to listen to voices he might once have dismissed without a second thought. Some in the town wondered whether genuine remorse had softened him, while others believed he simply understood, at last, the political cost of dismissing warnings too readily. Whatever the true reason, Ravenmore benefited from the change, regardless of what drove it. Nora's advisory position grew steadily more influential over the following years, her sharp observation and steady judgment earning respect from nobles who had once refused to acknowledge her presence in their halls. She continued living near the eastern cliffs, though her small cottage slowly transformed into something resembling a proper home, filled with books and records she gathered, while helping Edmund maintain the coastal archive that had once nearly cost his father everything to compile alone. Edmund's leg never fully healed, and he continued walking with his cane for the rest of his life, though he stopped noticing the occasional whispers that had once followed him so painfully through the castle halls. The people of Ravenmore no longer saw a broken duke struggling to prove his worth. They saw the man who had walked into the sea itself to save a stranger, who had trusted an outcast when nobody else would, and who had ultimately proven that careful observation and quiet courage mattered far more than title, standing, or the ability to walk without pain. Years later, long after the immediate memory of the wave had settled into Ravenmore's history, as a lesson rather than an open wound, young children growing up along the rebuilt shoreline learned the story of the crippled duke and the outcast fisherman's daughter as one of the town's most treasured tales, told not as distant legend, but as a living reminder of what could happen when courage and careful attention triumphed over pride and comfortable dismissal. Edmund often visited the new watchtowers himself in his later years, climbing the gentle inland paths slowly with the help of a walking stick that had long since replaced his original cane, watching young volunteers scan the horizon with the same careful attention his father had once practiced alone, dismissed and unheard, in the quiet solitude of his study. On one such evening, many years after the wave had reshaped Ravenmore's history, Edmund stood beside Nora at the very same harbor railing where they had first watched the water pull back together, both of them older now, their partnership having weathered far more than that single devastating storm. "Do you ever wonder," Nora asked quietly, watching the calm evening tide roll gently against the rebuilt docks below. What might have happened if you had simply given up after that first council meeting? If the mockery had convinced you to stay silent? Edmund considered the question for a long moment, the same question he had privately turned over countless times throughout the years since. "I think about it more than I once did," he admitted. "But I believe, even in my darkest moments after that meeting, some part of me understood that silence would have cost far more than any humiliation the council could offer. My father died believing his warnings meant nothing. I could not let that happen to me as well, not when so many lives depended on someone being willing to keep speaking, regardless of who was listening. And if I had never come to that archive tower," Nora added softly, "if I had decided my own history of being dismissed made it easier to simply stay silent and safe, then perhaps neither of us would have found the courage to keep pushing forward," Edmund said, reaching over to take her hand gently in his own, a gesture that had grown natural over the years they had spent building something far more lasting than mere partnership. "We saved each other as much as we saved this town, Nora. Perhaps more than either of us realized at the time." The tide continued its gentle, ordinary rhythm below them, calm and predictable, exactly as it should be, watched carefully now by people who understood, through hard-earned experience, that the sea always gave warning before it demanded its price. Ravenmore stood strong along that rebuilt shoreline, its people wiser and more attentive than they had ever been before, carrying forward the legacy of two people the town had once dismissed entirely, a crippled duke and the outcast who trusted him when nobody else would. And though the mockery that had once followed Edmund so painfully through the castle halls had long since faded into distant memory, replaced instead by genuine respect and quiet admiration, he never forgot the lesson those difficult early days had taught him. Truth did not always arrive wrapped in noble titles or spoken with confident authority. Sometimes it arrived limping on a cane or standing quietly at the edge of a crowd, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to finally listen. Ravenmore never forgot either, and for generations afterward, whenever the tide pulled back further than it should along that careful, watchful shoreline, its people remembered to look closely, to listen carefully, and to trust the voices too often dismissed before, understanding at last that the truest warnings rarely come from those the world expects to hear them, but from those brave enough to speak regardless of who chooses to believe them.